In a quiet Belfast suburb, a loving couple lived an ordinary life, until one November morning in 2020, when silence was shattered by a hammer's blow. What drove a former BBC security guard to kill his devoted wife? This is the haunting story of love, illness, and irreversible tragedy. It was a quiet November morning in 2020 in Newtown Abbey, a suburban area on the northern edge of Belfast, Northern Ireland. The air was still, the streets nearly empty, and nothing seemed unusual about the small house on Fernack Drive where Susan and Gary Baird lived. To their neighbors, they were an ordinary couple, private, polite, and steady. But behind the front door of that modest home, a lifetime of love, strain, and mental decline was quietly unfolding toward tragedy. Susan Baird was in her mid-60s, known to those around her as a gentle and thoughtful woman. She kept to herself, often seen tending to her garden or chatting briefly with neighbors on her way to the shops. Her husband, Gary Alexander Baird, also in his 60s, had once worked as a security guard for the BBC. He was considered reliable and soft-spoken, though in recent years, people had noticed that he seemed withdrawn. The couple had been married for decades, and to anyone passing by, their life looked peaceful. But that peace had been eroding for a long time. Gary had always been a man of routine. His work at the BBC brought him a sense of order and discipline. But after retiring, he began to change. Friends and family noticed that he became more anxious, less talkative, and sometimes confused. He suffered from depression, which deepened after his retirement and the isolation that came with it. Susan was patient. She supported him, reassuring him that things would get better, but his mental health continued to deteriorate. In the years leading up to 2020, Gary's behavior grew increasingly unpredictable. He had trouble sleeping, and his moods shifted without warning. There were moments when he seemed fine, quiet, but functional. Other times, he appeared lost in thought, as if haunted by something only he could see. Susan tried to help him seek treatment. She encouraged him to see doctors, to talk about how he was feeling. But Gary often refused. Like many of his generation, he saw mental illness as something to be endured, not discussed. Neighbors later recalled that they rarely heard raised voices from the house. There was no public sign of violence or abuse. The Bairds seemed like a couple who had weathered life's challenges together. But inside their home, tension was building. Gary's depression had deepened into something darker, paranoia and delusion. He began believing that things around him were out of control, that people were talking about him, or that something was wrong in the world that only he could sense. Susan, meanwhile, continued to live with compassion and hope. She had spent years standing by her husband, trying to manage his illness quietly. But her patience was wearing thin. Living with someone in the grip of severe mental illness is exhausting, and despite her best efforts, she could not reach him. Friends later said that Susan sometimes mentioned Gary's strange moods, his forgetfulness, and his irritability, but she never expressed fear. She loved him and wanted to help him find peace. On the morning of November 11th, 2020, something inside Gary broke. It was an ordinary day. No visitors, no arguments loud enough for neighbors to hear, just the two of them inside their small home. Gary's mind was no longer rational. The weight of his mental illness had reached its peak. Something triggered him, no one knows exactly what, and years of inner turmoil erupted in a single horrific act. Gary picked up a hammer and struck Susan repeatedly. The blows were fatal. In those moments, the quiet home that had once been a place of shared life and love turned into a scene of unimaginable violence. There was no shouting, no sound of struggle heard from the street. It all happened quickly, in silence and confusion. When it was over, Gary stood there, stunned. The woman who had cared for him for so many years was dead, and the reality of what he had done slowly began to sink in. There was no attempt to hide the crime or escape. Instead, he called the police himself. His voice was described as calm but distant when he told the operator what had happened. Officers arrived shortly after and found Susan's body inside the house. Gary was still there, distraught and trembling. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't try to explain himself. He simply told them that he had done something terrible. The scene left officers shaken. It was not a typical case of domestic violence or revenge. There were no signs of prolonged conflict or abuse, no evidence of financial disputes, infidelity, or anger. Instead, investigators immediately sensed that this was a tragedy rooted in mental breakdown. Gary was taken into custody and transported to a police station in Belfast. From the very beginning, his demeanor was subdued. He seemed confused about what had happened, and at times spoke as though he couldn't believe it himself. As detectives began to piece together the story, they learned about Gary's long struggle with mental illness. His medical history revealed years of depression and psychological instability. They also found no record of violence or criminal behavior. Susan had never reported feeling unsafe. To the people who knew them, it was unimaginable that Gary, quiet, reserved, and gentle, could commit such an act. But the evidence was clear, and Gary did not deny it. News of Susan's death spread quickly across the community. Neighbors gathered outside the home in disbelief. For many, it was hard to comprehend that such a horrific act had happened on their quiet street. Local media reported that a woman in her 60s had been killed and that a man, believed to be her husband, had been arrested. But few details were released at that time. Police described it as a domestic incident under investigation, and speculation began to circulate. Friends of the couple who spoke to reporters described Susan as a kind, caring woman, and Gary as a man who had seemed troubled in recent months. One neighbor mentioned that Gary often appeared nervous, pacing outside his home or standing quietly by the garden fence. Others recalled that Susan sometimes looked tired or anxious, but never spoke ill of her husband. In the days that followed, detectives continued gathering evidence from the house. The hammer used in the attack was recovered. Forensic teams worked carefully through the rooms, collecting anything that could help them understand what had led to the killing. But in many ways, the answer was already apparent. This was not a crime of hate or greed. It was the tragic outcome of a mind collapsing under illness. Gary was moved to a secure mental health facility for evaluation. Doctors began assessing his state of mind, noting signs of severe depression and possible psychosis. He was described as deeply remorseful, barely able to speak about what had happened. In interviews, he often broke down, expressing confusion and regret. Back in the neighborhood, tributes to Susan began appearing outside her home. Bouquets of flowers, handwritten notes, and candles filled the small space near the front gate. The community mourned her loss quietly, struggling to make sense of how a woman who had shown so much patience and love could die in such a violent way. As the police investigation continued, the broader picture of the Baird's life came into focus. They were not wealthy, not socialites, just an ordinary couple nearing the later years of life. Their days were spent quietly, their world small and simple. Susan had dedicated her time to caring for Gary, and in the end, that devotion placed her in the path of his illness. By late November, Gary Baird was officially charged with the murder of his wife, Susan Baird. The charge marked the beginning of a legal process that would reveal the depth of his mental deterioration and the terrible cost of his untreated illness. For now, the community waited, the headlines faded, and the small house on Fernack Drive remained silent, a painful reminder of how a life built over decades could end in a single devastating moment. After Gary Baird was arrested for killing his wife, Susan, in their home on Fernack Drive, the police investigation moved carefully through every stage. Detectives wanted to understand not just how the killing happened, but why. There was no sign of a break-in, no robbery, and no history of violence between the couple. Nothing pointed to anger or revenge. It looked like a moment of madness, a breakdown that had reached its most tragic end. At the station, Gary spoke quietly. He didn't deny what he'd done. His words were few, but what he did say made it clear he wasn't fully aware of his own actions. He told officers that he couldn't sleep, that his mind had been racing, and that he'd felt something snapping. Investigators noted how detached he seemed, his tone heavy but flat. There was no aggression, only confusion. The first priority for police was to gather every possible piece of evidence. Forensic teams returned to the house again and again. The hammer used in the attack was photographed, tested, and sealed away. The house itself told a small but powerful story. There were no signs of a struggle beyond the room where Susan died. One of the detectives described the scene as still, quiet, and heartbreaking. Everything about it suggested that the violence had come suddenly, without warning. As the facts were confirmed, attention turned to Gary's state of mind. The authorities arranged for him to undergo psychiatric evaluations. He was transferred from a regular holding cell to a secure hospital setting, where doctors could monitor him closely. There, over a period of weeks, psychiatrists assessed his behavior, mood, and thought patterns. What they found was consistent with years of mental decline. Gary suffered from major depressive disorder and symptoms of psychosis. He had been living in a state of inner torment, convinced at times that people were watching him or that he had done something terribly wrong when in reality he hadn't. Friends and family began to come forward with pieces of his story. One relative described Gary as a kind man who lost his way. Another recalled how, in the months before Susan's death, he had seemed distracted and paranoid. He sometimes spoke about things that didn't make sense, like believing his phone was being listened to, or that people on television were sending him messages. Susan, ever patient, had tried to calm him down. She had even contacted her doctor for advice about getting help for Gary, but he often refused to go to appointments. The investigation showed that there had been no ongoing domestic abuse. Susan's medical and police records showed no previous complaints or injuries. This wasn't a relationship poisoned by anger. It was one weighed down by illness. Detectives soon realized that what they were dealing with was not a straightforward criminal case, but a mental health tragedy. The case was then handed over to the Public Prosecution Service, which began preparing for court. Initially, Gary was charged with murder, as is standard in such cases. But as the psychiatric evidence came in, it became clear that his mental state at the time of the killing was not that of a sane man. Doctors concluded that his depression and delusional thoughts had severely impaired his ability to think rationally or control his actions. The legal process took months. The pandemic had slowed down court schedules, and every evaluation took time. Gary remained in hospital custody under medical supervision. During interviews, he rarely spoke about the act itself. Instead, he talked about Susan, how good she had been to him, how patient, and how much he loved her. His remorse was evident, but so was his confusion. Meanwhile, the Baird family and the wider community struggled to make sense of what had happened. Neighbors still spoke of Susan with deep affection. Many described her as the kind of person who never had a bad word to say about anyone. One neighbor told a reporter that she had seen Susan just days before the killing and that nothing had seemed unusual. She smiled, said hello, and asked about my daughter. She was the same Susan as always, warm and kind. The tragedy also brought renewed attention to the issue of mental health among older adults in Northern Ireland. Commentators pointed out that Gary's case wasn't isolated. Depression, paranoia, and cognitive decline often go unnoticed in older men, especially those who are reluctant to seek help. The pandemic had made things worse, isolating people who already felt cut off from the world. While Gary waited for his court date, psychiatrists continued their assessments. They concluded that at the time of the killing, he had been suffering from a severe mental disorder that significantly reduced his understanding of reality. Their report stated that he wasn't driven by anger or hatred, but by delusion and despair. As months passed, the case slowly moved toward trial. In early 2021, prosecutors began discussions with his defense team. Both sides agreed that the central issue was Gary's mental capacity. After reviewing medical reports and statements, the Crown accepted that the charge of murder should be reduced to manslaughter due to diminished responsibility. This decision was not taken lightly. Manslaughter on these grounds means that while the person committed the act, their ability to understand or control it was severely affected by mental illness. The prosecution's acceptance of this plea recognized that Gary's condition had played a direct role in Susan's death. Even so, the process of getting to that point was long. The court had to ensure that justice was served and that Susan's life was honored with truth and accountability. For her family, the wait was painful. They had lost not only Susan, but also the version of Gary they once knew. During this time, Gary remained under medical care. Those who worked with him in the facility described him as quiet and compliant. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and he spent most of his time reading or sitting alone. He often asked about Susan, and when reminded of what had happened, he would lower his head and begin to cry. The court heard from psychologists who testified that Gary's illness had developed slowly over years. His depressive episodes had become more severe, and without consistent treatment, his mind had become trapped in delusion. They explained that such cases are complex. Mental illness can cloud judgment to the point where people act out of fear or confusion rather than intent. As the legal proceedings moved closer to sentencing, the details of Susan's final moments became clearer through forensic reports. The pathologist confirmed that she died instantly from head injuries caused by multiple blows. There were no defensive wounds, which indicated that she hadn't anticipated the attack or tried to fight back. It was a horrifying detail that underscored how sudden and unexpected the violence was. For the community, the case had shifted from shock to sorrow. People left flowers outside the Baird home for months. Cards and messages described Susan as a woman of grace, a loyal wife, and a friend all. The quiet street where they had lived remained haunted by what had happened, but there was also compassion. Many residents understood that Gary's crime came from illness, not cruelty. By the time the case returned to court in 2022, everyone involved, the lawyers, the doctors, and the family, knew that the focus was no longer on guilt, but on understanding. Gary had admitted what he did. The question that remained was how to balance justice with mercy. The courtroom atmosphere was solemn. There were no dramatic exchanges or heated arguments. Instead, there was a sense of collective grief. The prosecution laid out the facts of the killing, the evidence gathered, and the psychiatric reports. The defense emphasized Gary's lifelong history of good behavior, his mental health struggles, and his deep remorse. Each new detail painted the same picture: a devoted husband whose mind had failed him, and a loving wife who had paid the ultimate price for that collapse. When the court finally reconvened for Gary Baird's sentencing, almost 2 years had passed since that quiet November morning in 2020. The courtroom was somber and still. The atmosphere carried the weight of grief more than anger. Family members sat together, silent, their faces drawn. It was a day no one had ever imagined would come, a husband standing accused of killing the woman he loved for over 40 years. The prosecution began by outlining the details once more. The events were clear and undisputed. On November 11, 2020, Gary Alexander Baird, a man in his late 60s and a former BBC security guard, had struck his wife, Susan Baird, repeatedly with a hammer inside their home on Fernack Drive in Newtown Abbey, just outside Belfast. The attack was sudden, unprovoked, and fatal. Susan, also in her 60s, had no chance to defend herself. Afterward, Gary had called the police himself and confessed. When officers arrived, he was waiting for them, visibly distraught and in shock. But the question the court needed to address wasn't whether Gary had killed his wife, it was why. The defense presented the results of extensive psychiatric evaluations, which showed that Gary had been suffering from severe depressive illness and delusional disorder. Doctors described his mental state as deeply impaired, his thinking clouded by paranoia and confusion. In the months before the killing, his condition had worsened to the point where he could no longer distinguish between reality and his own dark thoughts. The prosecution did not dispute this. They acknowledged that Gary's illness had played a central role in the tragedy. This was not a case of domestic abuse, jealousy, or rage. It was a case of mental collapse. The Crown accepted that Gary's responsibility for his actions had been diminished. Susan's family listened quietly as the evidence was read out. Photos of the couple from happier times were shown in court, two people smiling side by side, unaware of what their future held. The defense spoke softly, describing Gary as a man who had lived an honest life, worked hard, and never before shown violence or cruelty. They painted a picture of a person who had fallen into a deep, untreated despair that slowly consumed him. When it was Gary's turn to speak, his words were barely audible. He apologized to Susan's family, his voice shaking. He said he loved her and would never forgive himself for what he had done. Observers noted how fragile he looked, thin, tired, and broken. It was clear that whatever sentence he received, the true punishment would remain with him for the rest of his life. The judge then summarized the findings. He spoke of the couple's long marriage and Susan's role as a devoted wife who had cared for her husband through years of illness. He acknowledged that Gary's mental condition had profoundly affected his actions and that the killing was not driven by anger or malice. Still, he said, a life had been taken, and the law required that such an act could not go without consequence. Gary Baird was formally convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The judge sentenced him to 7 years in prison, noting that part of the sentence would include license conditions, meaning he would be closely monitored upon release. The sentence reflected the court's recognition of both the seriousness of the crime and the extraordinary weight of Gary's mental illness. As the sentence was read, Gary lowered his head. There were no outbursts, no protests. The courtroom remained silent. Susan's family wept quietly, not out of anger but sorrow, a grief too deep for words. They had lost her forever, and even though the man responsible sat before them, there was no sense of victory or relief, only loss. Outside the court, reporters gathered, but the family offered no statements. The police released a brief comment, acknowledging the tragedy of the case and extending sympathy to the victims' relatives. The story was covered across Northern Ireland, with headlines describing the hammer killing of Susan Baird and the mental health tragedy behind the crime. In the weeks that followed, discussions emerged in Belfast about how mental illness is often overlooked in older adults, especially men who hide their struggles out of pride or fear of judgment. Gary's case became a sad example of what can happen when illness goes untreated and when the warning signs are missed. At the secure facility where Gary served the first part of his sentence, he remained quiet and cooperative. He spent most of his time alone, reading or attending therapy sessions. Staff members noted that he expressed constant remorse. He talked about Susan often, how much he missed her, how he wished he could undo that morning. He never once tried to excuse himself or blame his illness. He simply said he failed her, and that he would live with that failure forever. The tragedy also affected the small community in Newtown Abbey. For months after the killing, the house on Fernack Drive remained empty. Neighbors said they still found it difficult to walk past it. Some described how the home that had once looked warm and ordinary now stood as a reminder of how fragile life can be. Flowers and cards continued to appear at the front gate for more than a year, left by those who couldn't forget Susan's gentle presence. Friends described Susan as a woman who never complained, even when life was hard. They remembered her kindness, her calm nature, and her steady loyalty to her husband. Many said that if she had seen what was happening to Gary, she would have been the first to ask others to show him compassion. That thought brought some comfort to those who mourned her. As time passed, Gary's case remained a subject of quiet reflection. It wasn't a sensational crime. It didn't fit the typical pattern of violence. It was a story of love and illness, of a man who lost his grip on reality and destroyed the one person who had never stopped believing in him. It showed how tragedy can grow in silence, how a mind can crumble without anyone realizing how close it is to collapse. When Gary eventually faced the possibility of release, it was under strict supervision. His license conditions meant that he would remain under psychiatric care and constant monitoring. He was no longer seen as dangerous in the traditional sense, but the authorities understood that his illness required lifelong management. For him, freedom would never be full freedom. It would be shadowed by memory and guilt. In the heart of Toronto, a quiet home became the scene of a shocking crime. A devoted security officer, a loving wife, and one fatal argument that shattered everything. What pushed an ordinary man to turn his weapon on the woman he vowed to protect? The truth unfolds here. Toronto, Ontario, a city known for its calm streets and steady rhythm, was shaken one quiet evening when a domestic dispute turned into a tragedy that stunned the community. The people involved were an ordinary couple, Stephen Harris and his wife, Marina Harris, a husband and wife who lived in a modest home on the city's outskirts. Stephen, a 38-year-old security officer, had worked long shifts at different buildings across downtown Toronto. Marina, 35, managed most of the household responsibilities and part-time office work. They had been married for nearly a decade and were known by neighbors as polite and private, rarely seen arguing in public. Yet behind closed doors, tensions were building slowly, and neither of them seemed to realize how deep the cracks had become until it was too late. Stephen Harris's work life had always been demanding. As a security officer, he often worked double shifts, covering overnight hours that stretched his patience and energy thin. The nature of his job meant he was constantly alert, dealing with late-night incidents, rowdy crowds, and long stretches of solitude. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady. He carried a quiet sense of duty, believing that providing for his household was his main purpose. However, over time, the fatigue, lack of rest, and financial pressures began to take their toll. Marina Harris, by contrast, was known for her warmth and social nature. Friends described her as kind, approachable, and deeply caring. She had dreams that extended beyond their small home. She wanted stability, a vacation once in a while, and a little more time together as a couple. But Stephen's long hours made that difficult. She often told her sister over the phone that she felt like she was living alone, even though her husband came home every night. She wasn't angry, just exhausted from trying to keep things afloat emotionally. Money had become the main source of tension in their marriage. Bills piled up, and Stephen's paycheck barely kept pace with expenses. Marina's part-time income helped, but it wasn't enough to cover everything. They had fallen behind on utilities and car payments. Stephen picked up extra shifts to make up for it, which only meant more hours away from home and less communication between them. Each time Marina tried to talk about finances, the conversations turned tense. Stephen would respond defensively, insisting he was doing everything he could. She would counter that she wanted him home, not just working himself to exhaustion. The discussions usually ended in silence, a silence that grew heavier with time. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, the couple's arguments became more frequent. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices coming from their home, though they dismissed it as a normal marital dispute. No one could have guessed how serious it had become. One night, Marina's close friend, a co-worker from her office, said she noticed Marina seemed unusually distant and distracted during a shift. When asked if everything was okay, Marina forced a smile and said, "We're just having one of those tough patches. It'll pass." But it didn't. The night of the incident began like many others. Stephen had returned home late from another double shift. He was tired, hungry, and irritable. Marina was waiting for him, anxious to talk. Their latest electricity bill had arrived, and it was higher than expected. She also wanted to discuss the growing debt they had accumulated on their credit card. Stephen, exhausted and frustrated, didn't want to talk about money. He dropped his bag by the door and went straight to the kitchen for a drink of water. Marina followed him, holding the bill in her hand. The conversation started calmly, but quickly grew sharp. She questioned why he kept taking on more hours, but their finances still looked worse. Stephen snapped back that she didn't understand how much pressure he was under. Words like failure and ungrateful were exchanged, each cutting deeper than intended. The argument moved from the kitchen to the living room, their voices rising. At one point, Marina told him that working endless hours was not saving their marriage. It was destroying it. Stephen, already on edge, accused her of not appreciating his sacrifices. What followed was a storm of emotions that neither could control. The argument escalated to shouting. Marina, reportedly, said she couldn't live like this anymore, that the stress was unbearable. Stephen, in a moment clouded by anger and exhaustion, went to the bedroom where he kept his licensed firearm, a weapon he owned legally due to his job as a security officer. He had carried it for years without incident. That night, however, something inside him broke. Witnesses later said they heard a loud noise, followed by silence. It was just after 10 p.m. when a single gunshot shattered the calm of their neighborhood. When police arrived, called by worried neighbors who had heard shouting followed by the sound of a gun, they found Marina Harris lying unresponsive in the living room. Stephen Harris was not running or hiding. He had already called the 911 and told the operator what he had done. His voice, according to reports, was flat and distant. "I've shot my wife," he said. "It was an argument. I didn't mean for it to go this far." When officers arrived, Stephen was sitting on the front steps, his hands on his knees, waiting for them. He surrendered quietly and did not resist arrest. Inside the home, officers found the firearm placed neatly on the coffee table. The scene was calm, almost unnervingly so, given what had just occurred. Neighbors watched from their porches as police cars lined the street, their lights reflecting off nearby windows. Some of them couldn't believe it. To most people who lived nearby, Stephen and Marina were the last couple anyone would suspect of such violence. They seemed normal, one neighbor told a reporter. He was quiet but polite. She always waved when she passed by. The police took Stephen into custody that night. He was calm, cooperative, and visibly exhausted. When questioned briefly at the scene, he said only, "It got out of hand." By midnight, the Harris home had been cordoned off with yellow tape. Detectives and forensic teams began documenting the scene. The overturned chair, the half-finished dinner, and the small stack of unpaid bills on the dining table. It was a picture of ordinary life interrupted by irreversible tragedy. The news broke the following morning across Toronto. Local outlets like the Toronto Sun and CBC carried headlines describing the incident as a domestic shooting involving a security guard. The early reports confirmed that Stephen Harris had been charged with second-degree murder, a charge used in cases where the act was intentional but not premeditated. As the story unfolded, friends, co-workers, and neighbors tried to make sense of what had happened. Some described Stephen as quiet but responsible, someone who took pride in his work. Others remembered Marina as cheerful and social, a woman who wanted more peace in her home. Their friends said they were surprised but not entirely shocked. They knew the couple had been struggling with stress for months. That night marked the beginning of a case that would draw attention not because it was sensational, but because it was heartbreakingly ordinary. It showed how everyday pressures, when left unresolved, can lead to devastating consequences. As Stephen sat in a police cell in downtown Toronto, the gravity of what had happened began to sink in. His life and Marina's had both been destroyed in a single moment of rage. The investigation had only begun, and soon the courts, the community, and the media would examine every detail, trying to understand why a hard-working man, known for keeping order and safety in his job, had turned a weapon on the person he was supposed to protect most. The first night ended with the city in quiet disbelief. A family was gone, a neighborhood was shaken, and a man who had spent his life guarding others now found himself behind bars, waiting for justice to take its course. The days after the shooting felt heavy across the Toronto neighborhood where Stephen and Marina Harris had lived. Police vehicles and media vans lined the quiet residential street. Reporters gathered near the corner, interviewing neighbors who still struggled to put their shock into words. It was the kind of story that didn't fit the usual pattern of crime headlines. There was no history of organized crime, no strangers involved, no dramatic chase. It was a tragedy born inside a marriage that had quietly fallen apart. In the first 48 hours, investigators focused on reconstructing what had happened inside the Harris home that night. Detectives from the Toronto Police Homicide Unit interviewed neighbors, co-workers, and family members. Each interview painted a picture of a couple who had been struggling under the weight of daily pressures. Marina's sister described her as tired but hopeful, saying Marina had been planning to take a few days off from work to clear her head. Stephen's colleagues at the security firm said he had recently been taking more overtime than usual, covering shifts for younger guards who couldn't handle the long hours. He was dependable, one co-worker told investigators. You could always count on Stephen to show up, no matter how exhausted he was. When detectives questioned Stephen at the station, he was quiet but cooperative. According to police records, he didn't try to deny what happened. He told them that the argument started over their bills, then escalated when Marina accused him of never being home. "She said I cared more about my job than our life together," he said during the recorded interview. "I told her I was doing everything for us. I didn't even realize how angry I'd gotten." His voice on the recording was described as flat, drained of emotion. Detectives listened as Stephen explained how he walked to the bedroom, opened the drawer where his work firearm was kept, and returned to the living room. "I didn't plan it," he said. "It was like everything just blurred. I wasn't thinking." When asked if he remembered pulling the trigger, Stephen reportedly paused before answering. "I remember the sound. I remember her falling. Then I remember silence." The investigators believed him when he said it wasn't planned, but that didn't change the fact that Marina was gone. The Crown prosecutor reviewing the case agreed that second-degree murder was the appropriate charge. Intentional, but without premeditation. That distinction meant the court would have to decide whether Stephen's actions, fueled by rage and exhaustion, still carried enough intent to meet the definition of murder rather than manslaughter. As the story spread through local media, people began debating the larger issues behind it. Talk shows discussed domestic conflict, financial stress, and the mental strain of overwork. Some callers to radio programs sympathized with Stephen's fatigue, calling him a man pushed beyond his limits. Others were firm that no amount of stress could justify taking a life. It was a conversation that extended beyond one couple's tragedy and touched on the pressures of urban living in an expensive city. Meanwhile, Marina's family prepared for her funeral. It was held at a small church in North York, attended by relatives, co-workers, and a few of the neighbors who had known her. There were photographs of her smiling, standing in the garden, or posing with Stephen at family events years earlier when things had seemed easier. The pastor spoke briefly about the fragility of peace within a home and how quickly it can shatter when anger takes over. Stephen wasn't present. He sat in a Toronto detention center, awaiting his first court appearance. His lawyer, a public defender named Mark Bennett, met with him to go over the details. Stephen seemed dazed, barely eating or sleeping. Bennett later told reporters that his client was overwhelmed by guilt and remorse. At the first court hearing, Stephen appeared in a standard gray jumpsuit. His head was bowed as the judge read the charge: second-degree murder in the death of Marina Harris. The Crown attorney, representing the state, requested that he be held without bail. The defense didn't object. Bennett told the court that Stephen was not a flight risk, but understood the seriousness of the charge. The judge agreed to keep him in custody until trial. As the months went on, the legal process moved slowly, as it often does. The Crown assembled evidence: photographs of the scene, the gun, the autopsy report, the 911 call recording, and testimony from neighbors. The defense focused on Stephen's emotional state, the long work hours, and the history of stress that had built up over time. The story became a regular feature in the Toronto news cycle. Headlines described it as a case of domestic despair. Editorials discussed how easy it is for financial stress to destroy relationships. Experts were interviewed about how mental fatigue and isolation can lead to irrational outbursts. Through it all, Stephen remained quiet. In his cell, he kept mostly to himself. Fellow inmates described him as polite but withdrawn. He spent his days reading and writing notes for his lawyer. Those who spoke to him said he seemed lost in thought, replaying the same moment over and over in his head. Marina's family, meanwhile, tried to move forward. Her sister took in Marina's belongings, sorting through photographs and clothes, struggling to understand how a simple argument could end in such finality. She loved him, her sister told a local reporter. That's what hurts the most. Even when they fought, she still believed things would get better. Detectives later confirmed there had been no prior police reports from the Harris home. There was no record of domestic violence, no previous signs of physical harm. It was, in every sense, an ordinary household that had suddenly collapsed under unseen pressure. By the time the trial date was set, more than a year had passed since the shooting. Public interest had cooled, but for those directly affected, The grief had not faded. The prosecution was prepared to argue that, regardless of exhaustion or stress, Stephen had made a conscious choice to retrieve the firearm and pull the trigger. The defense would argue that it was a spontaneous act, triggered by emotional and mental collapse, not a deliberate killing. Behind those legal arguments was the deeper tragedy: two people caught in a cycle of frustration, fear, and silence. If either had walked away that night, the story might have ended differently. But neither did. In the weeks before the trial, the Toronto Sun published a feature on the case, describing it as a quiet storm of stress and emotion. The article highlighted how many working-class families in the city faced similar struggles: long hours, mounting debt, and a sense of hopelessness that crept in unnoticed. It wasn't an attempt to excuse Stephen's actions, but to place them in the context of how fragile life can become when pressure never lets up. As Stephen's trial approached, those who had known the couple prepared to take the stand. Marina's co-workers would testify about her fears of loneliness and exhaustion. Stephen's employer would confirm his long shifts and the stress of constant overtime. Psychologists were brought in to explain how chronic fatigue and emotional strain can distort judgment. Each piece of testimony was meant to help the jury understand not just what happened, but why. It was no longer only about a crime. It was about how ordinary life can unravel when help doesn't come soon enough. The stage was set for the courtroom to decide Stephen Harris's fate, a decision that would finally bring closure to a story that had begun with a simple argument in a quiet Toronto home. The trial of Stephen Harris began on a cold morning inside a downtown Toronto courtroom. It had been nearly 18 months since the night Marina Harris was killed. The courtroom was quiet as Stephen was brought in, dressed in a dark suit provided by his defense attorney. His face looked drawn and pale, a man aged far beyond his 38 years. On the other side of the room sat Marina's family, her sister, her parents, and a few friends, holding each other's hands for support. The air was tense, thick with grief and anticipation. The Crown opened its case with a clear statement. Stephen Harris had intentionally retrieved a loaded firearm, pointed it at his wife, and pulled the trigger. The prosecutor described it as an act of anger, not accident, and told the jury that while stress and exhaustion might have played a part, they could not erase intent. The Crown showed photographs from the crime scene, images of the modest living room, the overturned chair, and the gun lying on the coffee table. Each picture told a story of sudden violence. Witnesses were called one by one. The first were the responding officers who described arriving at the Harris home that night. One officer recounted how Stephen was waiting on the front porch, hands visible, his voice calm but hollow. Another officer said Stephen had immediately confessed, saying, "I shot my wife. We were fighting. I don't know what happened." The jury listened in silence as the 911 recording was played. Stephen's voice could be heard telling the dispatcher what he had done, sounding dazed, disconnected from reality. The next set of witnesses included neighbors. One elderly woman said she had heard loud voices, followed by a sharp sound she knew instantly was a gunshot. A younger couple described the moments after, when police cars and ambulances filled the street. "It didn't feel real," the neighbor said. "They were such a quiet couple. I never thought something like that could happen here." The Crown's most emotional moment came when Marina's sister took the stand. She spoke softly but firmly about the months leading up to her sister's death. She said Marina had complained about Stephen's long hours and the loneliness she felt. She wanted to fix things, her sister said. She believed he was just tired, that once things got better financially, they'd be okay again. When asked about the night of the shooting, her eyes filled with tears. "I still can't understand how it ended like this." She loved him. When it was time for the defense to present its case, attorney Mark Bennett focused on Stephen's mental and emotional condition. He argued that the shooting was not planned, that Stephen had reached a breaking point after months of fatigue, debt, and emotional strain. Bennett told the jury, this was not a calculated act. It was the result of a mind overwhelmed by exhaustion and anger. A psychologist testified for the defense, explaining that Stephen's long work hours and chronic lack of sleep had likely contributed to impaired judgment. The expert described how extreme fatigue can distort perception, leading to impulsive behavior. He wasn't thinking clearly, the psychologist said. He wasn't rational in that moment. Stephen did not take the stand immediately. When he finally did, the courtroom fell silent. Speaking softly, he described the night of the shooting in his own words. "We were fighting again. I was so tired. She was yelling, and I just wanted it to stop. I went to the bedroom, and I don't even remember making the decision to grab the gun. It was like my body moved before my mind did." His eyes stayed down as he spoke. "I loved Marina. I didn't mean to kill her. I don't even know who I was in that moment." During cross-examination, the prosecutor pressed him on the details. "You had time to go to the bedroom, unlock the drawer, take out the firearm, load it, and return to the living room. Is that correct?" Stephen nodded faintly. The prosecutor continued. "So, Mr. Harris, at any point during those steps, you could have stopped?" Stephen hesitated before answering. "Yes, I could have. But I didn't." That admission seemed to echo through the room. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Stephen Harris lowered his head when the verdict was read. Marina's family wept quietly, holding one another as the reality of the decision sank in. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following month. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was once again filled. The Crown asked for a life sentence as a standard for second-degree murder, with no chance of parole for 15 years. The defense requested leniency, citing Stephen's remorse and lack of prior record. Before the sentence was given, the judge allowed Stephen to address the court. He stood slowly, his voice trembling as he spoke. "There are no words that can undo what I did. Marina trusted me, and I destroyed that trust in one terrible moment. I think about her every day. I think about her laugh, her patience, how she stood by me even when I didn't deserve it. I wish I could trade places with her. I'm sorry to her family and to everyone who loved her. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to understand why I let anger control me." After a brief pause, the judge delivered the sentence. Stephen Harris was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. The judge called the case a tragedy born of silence and fatigue, a reminder that unchecked anger and stress can destroy even the most ordinary lives. As Stephen was led from the courtroom, he looked briefly toward Marina's family. Her sister did not look back. In the months that followed, the story faded from headlines, but it left a lasting mark on those who had known the couple. The neighborhood remained quiet, though the house where the tragedy occurred was eventually sold. New owners moved in, unaware of its history, though some longtime residents said they still avoided walking too close to it after dark. For Marina's family, healing came slowly. Her sister often spoke publicly about domestic conflict, urging couples to seek help before anger turns dangerous. "It's not about monsters," she said in one interview. "It's about ordinary people who lose control. We need to talk before it gets to that point." In prison, Stephen adapted to a quiet routine. He took part in counseling programs and attended therapy sessions focused on anger management and emotional awareness. Prison staff described him as polite and withdrawn, a man who rarely spoke unless spoken to. Over time, he began writing letters, not to ask for forgiveness, but to reflect on what had happened. In one letter to his lawyer, he wrote, "Every day, I replay that night. It never stops. It's like I'm trapped in that moment, wishing I had just walked away." The story of Stephen and Marina Harris remains one of the many tragic reminders that violence can emerge not from strangers, but from within the walls of a home. It was not a tale of hatred, but of exhaustion, fear, and silence, the slow unraveling of two people who once promised to stand by each other. In the end, the case stood as a quiet but powerful message. Stress and silence can be just as dangerous as anger. If left unspoken, they can turn love into loss and leave behind nothing but regret. It began on a humid Miami night, a routine shift, a parking lot, a security guard who swore he was just doing his job. But within seconds, 2 men were down, one dead, one fighting to breathe. What pushed Luckcase Kendall to pull the trigger and destroy everything? Miami After Dark comes with a pulse all its own. In June 2012, that pulse was sharp and bright outside Club Lex, a strip club tucked off Biscayne Boulevard where neon lights reflected on car hoods and the smell of liquor mixed with exhaust. The man stationed at the door most nights was Luckcase Kendall, a 26-year-old Army veteran turned armed security guard. He wore the uniform of authority, black polo, badge, gun, and liked the way people stepped back when he spoke. To coworkers, he could seem polite one moment and unpredictable the next. Some remembered him as a quiet veteran trying to rebuild life after service. Others said he carried himself with a chip on his shoulder, quick to take offense. Kendall had been on the job only a few months. He'd served in Iraq, came home with hearing loss, and what friends called short fuse moments. He found steady work in private security, a field that offered structure and a firearm, something he thought gave him purpose again. His supervisors at the company had given him basic training and a Glock .40 caliber pistol, trusting him to use it wisely. He lived a few miles from the club, alone, mostly keeping to himself. On the night of June 1st into the early hours of June 2nd, the club was crowded. Music thumped hard through the walls. Headlights flashed as people pulled into the gravel parking lot. Kendall was stationed near the entrance, checking IDs. A group of men, Keejuan Bird, 29, and Michael Smathers, 32, arrived after midnight, already tipsy, but not aggressive. They'd come to unwind, laugh, and drink, typical Friday night energy. Security told them to wait a few minutes, because the club was at capacity. They stepped aside toward their car, chatting and smoking. From witness accounts later given to police, Kendall left his post to get something from his vehicle. He walked past Bird and Smathers, eyeing them. Something small, a comment, a gesture, set him off. Words were exchanged. None of the men knew each other. What happened next would unfold in seconds, but alter lives permanently. Witnesses heard Kendall shout something like "Don't mess with me," before pulling his gun. Two sharp cracks echoed through the lot. Bird dropped first, shot in the chest. Smathers tried to run, but was hit in the leg. Panic rippled through the crowd. People screamed and ducked behind cars. Club music stopped. Some thought it was a fight. Others realized quickly it was gunfire. When the noise ended, Bird lay on the pavement motionless. Kendall stood over them, gun still raised. A few witnesses said he looked detached, almost calm, as if still in combat mode. He then called 911 himself, telling dispatch he'd been attacked by two black males and had fired in self-defense. When Miami police arrived, they found his pistol holstered and Kendall pacing near his car. Officers detained him without resistance. Bird was pronounced dead at the scene. Smathers was rushed to Jackson Memorial Hospital in serious condition. At first, it sounded like another late-night shooting in a city used to them, a guard, a dispute, a claim of self-defense. But detectives quickly saw inconsistencies. Witnesses said Bird and Smathers were unarmed. There was no sign of a fight beyond Kendall's word. Security cameras from nearby businesses captured part of the encounter. It looked one-sided. Investigators noted Kendall's tone, controlled, almost rehearsed, and the lack of injuries on his body. Detectives brought him in for questioning. He stuck to his story. He'd felt threatened, thought the men were reaching for a weapon, and fired to protect himself. The detectives pressed. Why not retreat? Why fire twice? Why aim at the chest? Kendall insisted he'd been outnumbered. Yet when police searched the victim's car and pockets, they found no weapon, no drugs, only a pack of cigarettes and a cell phone. By morning, the case was on every Miami news station. Security guard shoots two outside club, the headlines read. Reporters gathered footage of the flashing lights, the yellow tape, the body covered on the asphalt. Interviews with Bird's family painted a picture of a father of three, a man with a laugh so loud it filled a room. Smathers, still in a hospital bed, told detectives later that they never touched Kendall, never threatened him. They were just waiting for the club to open. The bullets came without warning. Prosecutors began reviewing the evidence. Under Florida law, the stand your ground defense was common. allowing people to use deadly force if they reasonably believed their lives were in danger. Kendall's lawyers immediately hinted at that argument. They said his military background made him hyper-aware of threats, that his training kicked in when he felt surrounded in a dark lot. But the surveillance video and witness statements told another story. A man who escalated an argument into a shooting. Meanwhile, the victims' families were grieving publicly. Bird's mother stood outside the courthouse, holding her son's photo, pleading for justice. Community activists questioned how someone with Kendall's temperament was allowed to carry a gun for work. It emerged that he'd once been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress and hearing issues, conditions that might have affected his judgment. Still, he'd passed the licensing requirements for armed security. That gap between qualification on paper and behavior in the field became a talking point in local news debates. Kendall spent the next weeks in jail, awaiting a bail hearing. Inside, he was described as polite but withdrawn, rarely speaking to others. He told one inmate he just wanted to prove it was self-defense. Outside, lawyers prepared a motion for release, arguing he was a decorated veteran, not a criminal. Prosecutors countered that he was a danger to the public and had shown reckless disregard for life. When the hearing came, the courtroom was tense. Reporters filled the first rows. Bird's relatives sat behind the prosecution, silent but present. The judge denied bond, citing the seriousness of the charges, one count of second-degree murder and one of attempted second-degree murder. Kendall was led back out in handcuffs, head down, eyes fixed on the floor. As the investigation deepened, more details surfaced. He had consumed alcohol earlier that evening, not much, but enough to raise questions about his state of mind. A toxicology test confirmed trace levels. His employers at the security firm cooperated with investigators, providing training logs, shift records, and weapon assignments. They told police they hadn't seen warning signs, though some co-workers recalled him talking about people testing him, and how you gotta show strength. To them, it had sounded like tough talk. After the shooting, it sounded like a red flag. The club's patrons who witnessed the shooting were interviewed over the following days. Their accounts aligned closely. The argument lasted under a minute. The victims never lunged or raised a hand, and Kendall fired almost immediately after shouting. One woman said she thought he was showing off his gun before realizing he'd fired it. Another described seeing Bird lift his hands as if to say, "We don't want trouble." That image stuck with investigators and prosecutors alike. By late summer, Miami-Dade prosecutors announced they would seek to bring the case to trial. They rejected the self-defense claim, saying the evidence pointed to an unjustified killing. Kendall's defense filed motions to dismiss under the Stand Your Ground statute, insisting he had a right to defend himself from what he perceived as a deadly threat. The courtroom battles that followed would test not just Kendall's actions, but the limits of how far perception can excuse violence. The trial process for Luck case, Kendall began more than a year after the shooting. But the echoes of that night in Miami still hung in the air. The case had stirred debate about race, gun laws, and the responsibility that comes with authority. It wasn't just about what happened in the parking lot of a strip club. It was about the split-second decisions of a man who carried both a weapon and a history of war inside him. When jury selection started, reporters described the courtroom as calm but heavy. Kendall sat at the defense table wearing a pale gray suit, hair closely cropped, hands folded in front of him. He looked smaller than the man in the news photos from the night of the arrest. The prosecution opened by showing the jury the layout of Club Lex parking lot, a bright strip of asphalt ringed by cars and neon. Then came the grainy video footage, silent but clear enough to show movement. Kendall walking toward two men, a brief exchange, then the flash of his gun. The jurors leaned forward. Witness after witness took the stand. One woman testified that Bird had both hands in plain view when the shots rang out. A valet said he saw the guard pull out, aim, and shoot before anyone else moved. The prosecutor, methodical and steady, painted Kendall as a man who carried his temper into his job. He reminded the jury that security work required restraint, not aggression. He was not under attack, the prosecutor said, pointing at Kendall. He was challenged, maybe disrespected, but not attacked. He chose to answer words with bullets. The defense countered with a different portrait. They described a combat veteran who had seen violence before, a man haunted by memories of danger, trained to react quickly when he sensed a threat. They said the victims were drunk, confrontational, and stepped too close. Kendall, they argued, reacted instinctively, not out of malice, but survival. His lawyer told the jury that perception in a chaotic moment can blur truth. "You don't get to pause and play back the tape in real life," he said. He believed he was in danger. That's what matters. For days, the jury listened to technical testimony. Ballistics experts explained the trajectory of the bullets, showing how the shots were fired at a downward angle, suggesting Kendall had aimed deliberately. A forensic pathologist described Bird's fatal wound, a single round to the chest that tore through his heart. The courtroom went silent as the medical examiner's photos appeared on the screen. Bird's mother closed her eyes and held her daughter's hand. Then came Michael Smathers, the surviving victim. He walked to the stand with a noticeable limp. His voice was quiet but firm. He told the court that neither he nor Bird had threatened Kendall. "They were laughing," he said, when the guard turned toward them, shouted, and fired. "He didn't warn us," Smathers said. "He just pulled the gun." The defense tried to challenge his memory, suggesting he was drunk, but Smathers didn't waver. "I remember the sound," he said. "I remember my friend falling." Behind the legal arguments, another story was unfolding in the background, one of policy and oversight. Journalists began investigating the private security industry in Florida. They found that licensing requirements allowed guards with minimal psychological screening to carry firearms. Kendall's record showed no prior criminal issues, but his mental health history was unclear. Reports surfaced that he had once been treated for PTSD symptoms after military service, though no one could say whether he was officially diagnosed. That detail became a flashpoint in the courtroom. The defense called psychologists who testified that Kendall showed signs of hypervigilance, a condition common among combat veterans. In his mind, sudden movement or loud voices could trigger a fight-or-flight response. The expert said this didn't excuse the shooting, but explained how Kendall could have genuinely believed he was under threat. The prosecution cross-examined sharply. "Isn't it true," the prosecutor asked, "that being afraid doesn't give someone permission to kill?" The witness paused. "It depends on whether the fear was reasonable," she said softly. The jury watched Kendall closely during this exchange. He rarely looked up. Sometimes he whispered to his lawyer, other times he stared straight ahead. Observers described him as expressionless, but his mother, sitting in the second row, dabbed her eyes with a tissue. She had told a reporter earlier that her son wasn't a monster. "He's a soldier," she said. "He was trained to survive." Midway through the trial, the defense introduced the 911 recording. In it, Kendall's voice sounded calm but shaky. He told dispatchers he had been attacked by two men and fired to protect himself. The prosecution replayed that call alongside the video footage, pointing out how the events on tape didn't match his description. No punches were thrown, no rushing movement toward him. "This is not fear," the prosecutor said. "This is anger." Outside the courtroom, protesters and supporters occasionally gathered, some demanding stricter gun control, others defending the right to self-defense. Local talk radio discussed whether veterans were being unfairly targeted or whether they needed better screening before being put in armed positions. Each day, the case became less about one man and more about the system that put him there. As the trial neared its close, the defense tried to humanize Kendall. They described his service overseas, the medals he'd earned, the jobs he'd held since coming home. A neighbor testified that he helped her carry groceries, that he was polite and soft-spoken. They wanted the jury to see a man, not just a shooter. But the prosecution reminded them of the video, the witnesses, the lifeless body on the pavement. "Good men can do terrible things," the prosecutor said. "That doesn't make the act any less terrible." The days stretched long, and every detail of that night was dissected. The angle of headlights in the parking lot, the distance between cars, the tone of voices before the gunshots. Experts debated whether Bird could have made any motion that seemed threatening. The defense emphasized uncertainty. The prosecution leaned on clarity. It became a battle between perception and proof. Reporters covering the case noted that Kendall never testified in his own defense. His lawyer advised against it, saying his demeanor could be misread by the jury. Instead, jurors watched clips of his interrogation. In those recordings, he appeared measured but defensive, repeating that he had no choice. Detectives challenged him on inconsistencies, why he didn't retreat, why he fired twice, why he didn't wait for backup. He had no clear answers. "I just reacted," he said in the video. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom felt drained. The prosecutor spoke first, pacing slowly in front of the jury. "A gun gives power," he said. "But power demands control." That night, LaCase Kendall lost control. He pointed to the victims' photos projected on the screen. 2 unarmed men. One dead, one crippled. This was not protection. This was a choice. The defense followed with a quieter tone. "He didn't wake up wanting to hurt anyone," the attorney said. "He was a guard doing his job, a veteran who saw danger and reacted the only way he'd been taught: eliminate the threat." You can't judge a moment of fear from the safety of a courtroom. He asked the jury to consider doubt, that small space between what is seen and what is felt. When the jury retired to deliberate, tension filled the room. Reporters waited in the hallway. Bird's family prayed silently. Hands joined. Hours passed. Evening shadows stretched across the courthouse lobby. Finally, word came that the jury had reached a decision. People shuffled back inside, hearts pounding, faces tight with expectation. Kendall was led in by deputies, still expressionless. The clerk unfolded the verdict form and began to read, but before the final words were spoken, the scene froze in that breathless moment between guilt and innocence. A city waiting to see whether fear, duty, or accountability would define what happened next. The outcome would soon close the story of a night that began with flashing lights and ended in silence. The courtroom was silent when the clerk read the verdict. Every eye was fixed on the jury foreman, who rose and announced the words that would define the rest of LaCase Kendall's life: guilty of second-degree murder and guilty of attempted second-degree murder. The air seemed to tighten. Kendall didn't flinch, didn't look toward the jury or his mother. He just exhaled and lowered his head slightly, as if bracing for the weight of what had finally caught up with him. Behind him, Bird's family began to cry quietly. They had waited more than 3 years for this moment. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. The sound of chairs scraping against the tile echoed through the room. When the jurors left, the reality of the conviction began to sink in. Kendall's mother sobbed as deputies guided her son away in handcuffs. The prosecutor stood off to the side, exhausted but composed, speaking softly with Bird's relatives. Outside, cameras flashed and microphones crowded the courthouse steps. Reporters called it a victory for justice, but inside the families, nothing felt victorious. One life lost, another locked away forever. In the weeks before sentencing, a pre-sentencing investigation gathered every piece of Kendall's background: military records, psychological evaluations, employment files. His lawyer requested leniency, citing his military service and claimed mental health issues. They argued that he wasn't a violent man by nature, just a soldier who had never truly left the war behind. The prosecution countered that his training made him even more responsible, not less. He was trusted with a weapon and used it recklessly. They reminded the court of the calmness in his 911 call, the absence of remorse immediately after the shooting. To them, it wasn't panic. It was pride disguised as justification. At the sentencing hearing, family members from both sides spoke. Bird's mother stepped to the podium first. Her voice trembled but carried strength. She said she forgave Kendall because hatred wouldn't bring her son back, but she wanted him to understand what he took away: a father, a son, a brother. Smathers, the surviving victim, still limped from his injury. He told the judge how that night had shattered his life, how the sound of gunfire still haunted him. Then came Kendall's turn. He stood, wrists cuffed in front of him, voice low and steady. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said. "I thought my life was in danger. I was wrong and I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, quiet but heavy. The judge spoke for nearly 10 minutes. He acknowledged Kendall's service, but said that service did not excuse his actions. "You were entrusted to protect others," the judge said. "Instead, you used that trust to justify violence. A uniform doesn't make killing lawful, and fear doesn't make it right." He sentenced Kendall to life in prison without parole for the murder of Kijun Bird and an additional 30 years for the attempted murder of Michael Smathers. The courtroom was still. Kendall nodded once, expression unreadable, as deputies led him away for the final time. After the sentencing, reporters revisited the story from the beginning: a train guard, an ordinary night, a sudden decision that turned fatal. The public conversation shifted toward accountability in private security work. Lawmakers debated tightening screening requirements for armed guards. Editorials questioned why mental health checks weren't mandatory for positions involving firearms. A few veterans groups came forward, urging better post-service counseling to prevent similar tragedies. The shooting had become not just a crime story, but a case study in the hidden pressures carried by those who return from war and take on roles of authority without proper support. In prison, Kendall's life became routine and silent. He was assigned to a medium security facility north of Miami, spending most days working in the kitchen. He kept mostly to himself, reading and writing letters to his family. Occasionally, he received visits from his mother, who continued to insist that her son wasn't an evil man, just one who broke under the strain of his past. She told reporters he prayed every day for forgiveness, though he rarely spoke about the night itself. His attorney filed appeals over the following years, claiming ineffective counsel and mental health misdiagnosis, but each motion was denied. For Bird's family, closure was complicated. His mother attended community events focused on nonviolence, speaking quietly to parents about raising sons in neighborhoods where guns too often decided arguments. Smathers eventually moved away from Miami, trying to rebuild his life. He carried the limp as a permanent reminder of what one man's fear could do. Every anniversary of the shooting, local news would run a short segment, showing Bird's smiling face beside the photo of Kendall in his uniform. Two lives that collided in a flash of gunfire. Over time, the story faded from national headlines, but remained part of Miami's history. One more tragedy that started with a misunderstanding and ended with irreversible loss. It was a reminder that authority, when mixed with insecurity and anger, can become deadly. Kendall's case became a quiet lesson in how perception and power can twist in a single moment. He will likely die behind bars, a man who once wore the badge of protection but became the focus of cautionary tales. And for the families left behind, the court's decision could never undo what was taken. Miami moved on, but in a small corner of its memory, under the hum of the city lights, the echoes of that night in June 2012 still linger. The sound of two gunshots, a man's voice on a 911 call, and the silence that followed when everything changed forever.